His name was James Anderson, 19 years old. He was trapped in the USS Oklahoma when she rolled over, and he drowned in absolute darkness while his lungs filled with fuel oil and seawater, and his fingernails tore off as he clawed at steel that wouldn't move. And his last thought was of his mother's face. That's where this story begins. Not with strategy, not with politics, with James Anderson drowning upside down in the dark, feeling his life end one burning second at a time, knowing nobody was coming, knowing this was how it ended, and screaming underwater where nobody could hear him. 7:48 in the morning. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In 90 seconds, 1,177 men aboard the USS Arizona stopped being human beings and became superheated vapor. But their bodies didn't burn. They vaporized. Skin, muscle, bone, memory, love, fear, everything they were and everything they would ever be transformed into gas and ash in a fireball that reached 3,000 degrees. Their mothers would receive telegrams. Their girlfriends would keep unopened letters. But there was nothing left to bury, nothing left to cry over. Just molecules dispersed across Pearl Harbor, atoms that once formed beating hearts and thinking minds, now indistinguishable from smoke. The water was on fire. Think about that. Water. On fire. The harbor surface was covered in fuel oil from ruptured ships, and when the Arizona exploded, the heat ignited it. Men jumped off burning ships into burning water. They surfaced, gasping, and their hair caught fire. Their faces caught fire. They dove under to escape the flames and drowned because their lungs were already scorched. Those who surfaced again found their skin sliding off their bodies like wet paper. The lucky ones died from shock. The unlucky ones stayed conscious, treading water with third-degree burns covering 70, 80, 90% of their bodies, screaming for help that would come too late or not at all, until their hearts simply stopped from trauma their brains couldn't process. Inside the capsized Oklahoma, 429 men were dying in the dark. Some drowned immediately when compartments flooded. Others found air pockets. They could hear rescuers outside, cutting through the hull. They pounded on the steel. They screamed. They waited. The cutting was slow, so slow, and the water kept rising. Some men survived for hours, writing goodbye messages to their families on bulkheads with whatever they could find, knowing they would die there, feeling the water climb from their ankles to their knees, to their waists, to their chests. When rescuers finally cut through days later, they found calendars scratched into the metal. 16 days marked off. 3 sailors had survived the attack, survived the capsizing, survived in an air pocket for over 2 weeks, and then suffocated when their oxygen ran out. They died slowly, in complete darkness, listening to their own breathing get shallower and harder until it stopped. On the deck of the West Virginia, Captain Mervyn Bennion stood at his post with his abdomen torn open by shrapnel. His intestines were visible. He was dying, and he knew it. But he kept giving orders, kept commanding his ship, and kept his voice steady even as shock and blood loss shut down his body organ by organ. He died standing up, refusing medical attention while wounded men around him had a chance to live. His last words were tactical orders about damage control. Then he collapsed and bled out on his own bridge while his ship sank beneath him. A sailor, his name was lost to history, was blown off the USS Nevada by an explosion. He hit the water hard enough to break his back. He couldn't move his legs, couldn't swim. He floated on his back, paralyzed from the waist down, watching the sky fill with Japanese aircraft and American anti-aircraft fire, watching ships explode and capsize around him, feeling the water temperature drop as he went into shock, knowing that even if someone pulled him out, he would never walk again. If they found him. What if they reached him before he drowned? If. He floated there for 40 minutes before a motor launch spotted him. He survived. But he left Pearl Harbor a different person than the one who woke up that morning. The young sailors, boys really, 18 and 19 years old, hadn't experienced death before December 7th. They'd never seen a human body torn apart, never smelled burning flesh, never heard the sound a man makes when he's on fire, a sound that isn't quite a scream and isn't quite human anymore. They saw it all in 2 hours. They saw their friends cut in half by propeller blades when they jumped off ships, saw men with their faces burned off, unrecognizable, wandering in shock, saw body parts, just parts, arms and legs and heads separated from the bodies they belonged to, floating in oil slicks, and saw men trying to hold their own organs inside their bodies with their hands. And they couldn't look away. Because if they looked away, they might miss someone who needed help, someone who could still be saved. The hospital at Pearl Harbor wasn't built for this, wasn't equipped for this. Nobody was. Doctors performed amputations on mess tables because the operating rooms were full. They sawed through bone without anesthesia because the morphine was gone. Men waiting for surgery died from blood loss before their turn came. Nurses, some of them barely 20 years old themselves, held down screaming patients while doctors cut away burned flesh that would kill them if left attached. The floors were slippery with blood. The air was thick with the smell of cauterized tissue and antiseptic and death. Outside, bodies were laid in rows. Oh, so many rows. Too many to count. Too many to process. They lay there in the sun while more wounded kept arriving, kept dying, kept adding to the count. And somewhere in Honolulu, a mother was making breakfast for her children when a spent anti-aircraft shell crashed through her roof and killed her instantly. Her children, 5 and 7 years old, found her body. That's not a military casualty. That's not a strategic loss. That's 2 children who will spend the rest of their lives remembering their mother's blood on the kitchen floor, remembering that Sunday morning when their world ended before they were old enough to understand why. This happened. All of it. Every word is documented. Every death recorded. Every scream remembered by someone who survived to tell it. This isn't exaggeration, but this is what war actually looks like when you strip away the maps and the strategy and the historical distance. This is what happens when 2,403 human beings, each one somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's father, somebody's whole world, are killed in 2 hours on a Sunday morning that started with coffee and newspapers and church services. December 7th, 1941. The date that lives in infamy. But infamy is just a word, just another way to avoid seeing what really happened, to avoid acknowledging that James Anderson died screaming in the dark, that 1,100 men became vapor in 6 seconds, that boys drowned in burning oil, that a captain bled out giving orders with his guts spilling onto the deck, that children found their mother's body, that 429 men suffocated slowly in the dark over 16 days. This is their story. Not the comfortable version, not the distant historical narrative. This is the raw, bleeding truth of what happened when the world caught fire over Pearl Harbor. And it started with screaming. Always, always with the screaming. The Attack on Pearl Harbor, Chapter 1, The Road to War. The morning air over Oahu carried the scent of tropical flowers and salt water. It was Sunday, December 7th, 1941. At 7:48 in the morning, Hawaiian time, that peaceful dawn transformed into something else entirely. The sound came first, a distant rumble growing louder, sharper, closer. Then the sky darkened with aircraft, hundreds of them. The rising sun insignia of Imperial Japan painted on their wings. Within seconds, the first bombs fell. Metal tore through metal, fuel ignited into towers of fire. Men who had been drinking coffee or writing letters home were suddenly burning alive, drowning in oil-slicked water, or trapped in flooding compartments as their ships rolled over and sank. The surprise was total. The devastation was catastrophic. And America would never be the same. But this morning of fire and blood did not arrive without warning. The path to Pearl Harbor had been paved with years of escalating tension between the United States and Imperial Japan. According to the Library of Congress, the conflict's origins lay in Japan's imperial ambitions across Asia and the Pacific. In July of 1937, Japanese forces invaded China, launching what would become a brutal 8-year occupation. The Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing provided the pretext. What followed was systematic conquest. The rape of Nanking in December 1937 shocked the world. Japanese troops massacred an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. The atrocities were documented by Western journalists and missionaries still in the city, their accounts preserved in the archives of Yale University's Divinity School. The United States watched these events with growing alarm. America had long-standing economic and missionary ties to China. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, while publicly maintaining neutrality, began applying economic pressure on Japan. In July 1939, the United States gave the required 6 months' notice to terminate its commercial treaty with Japan. When that treaty expired in January 1940, it opened the doors for escalating sanctions. The Roosevelt administration began restricting exports of strategic materials to Japan: aviation fuel, machine tools, scrap iron, and steel. Japan's response was to expand further. In September 1940, Japanese forces moved into French Indochina, taking advantage of France's defeat by Nazi Germany. The Vichy French government, powerless to resist, allowed Japanese occupation of northern Vietnam. This move brought Japan closer to vital resources in Southeast Asia, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. It also brought Japanese forces dangerously close to the Philippines, an American territory. On September 27, 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The agreement was clear. The three powers would support each other if attacked by any nation not currently involved in the European War or the Sino-Japanese conflict. This meant the United States, as documented by the National Archives. Thus, American intelligence understood immediately that this was aimed directly at deterring American intervention in either theater of conflict. Roosevelt's response was swift. In July 1941, after Japan occupied southern Indochina, the president froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch government in exile followed suit. Most critically, Roosevelt imposed a complete oil embargo on Japan. This was an economic death sentence. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the United States and its allies. The Imperial Japanese Navy's fuel reserves would last perhaps 18 months at current consumption rates. Without oil, the Japanese war machine would grind to a halt. Japan's military and industrial capacity would collapse. Yet diplomatic negotiations began in Washington between Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Japanese Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura. The talks dragged through the summer and fall of 1941. The American position was clear. Japan must withdraw from China and Indochina. The Japanese position was equally firm. The conquests were non-negotiable. According to research from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, both sides understood by November that diplomacy had failed. Japan faced a choice: surrender its imperial ambitions or go to war with the United States. The Imperial Japanese Navy had already made its decision. Chapter 2. Operation Z. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his cabin aboard the battleship Nagato in the fall of 1941, studying maps of the Pacific. He was 57 years old, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, where he had lost 2 fingers on his left hand at the Battle of Tsushima. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington and traveled extensively throughout America. He understood American industrial power better than almost any officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and that knowledge terrified him. Yamamoto had opposed the tripartite pact with Germany. He had argued against war with the United States. He told Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict with America. And according to documents preserved by the Naval History and Heritage Command, Yamamoto warned his superiors, "I can raise havoc with them for 1 year or at most 18 months. After that, I can give no one any guarantees." He knew that American industry could produce ships, aircraft, and weapons at a rate Japan could never match. Time was America's ally. Japan's only hope lay in a swift, devastating blow that might force a negotiated peace before American power could be fully mobilized. That blow would fall on Pearl Harbor. The plan took shape through the summer of 1941. Yamamoto assigned the operational details to his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, and the Combined Fleet's operations officer, Commander Minoru Genda. Genda was a brilliant tactical planner and a strong advocate for naval aviation. But the plan they developed was audacious to the point of recklessness. A carrier strike force would cross the northern Pacific, maintaining radio silence, and launch a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at its anchorage in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The risks were enormous. The strike force would need to travel over 3,000 miles across open ocean without being detected. American patrol aircraft from Oahu could spot them. American submarines could intercept them. The northern Pacific in winter was notoriously rough. Storms could scatter the fleet or make refueling impossible. If discovered early, the element of surprise would be lost, and the attacking carriers would face the full weight of land-based American aircraft and the coastal defenses of Oahu. But if it succeeded, while Japan could cripple the American Pacific Fleet in a single morning, Yamamoto estimated that such a blow might give Japan the 6 to 12 months it needed to consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia, seizing the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber and tin of Malaya, the rice of Burma and Indochina. By the time America recovered, Japan would control a vast defensive perimeter across the Pacific. The cost of breaking that perimeter might be too high. America might seek a negotiated peace rather than a years-long bloodbath across thousands of miles of ocean. Training began in October 1941. Japanese pilots practiced at Kagoshima Bay in southern Japan, which resembled Pearl Harbor's geography. Torpedo bombers perfected low-level runs in shallow water. Dive bombers practiced precision attacks on moving targets. And horizontal bombers, aircraft that dropped bombs from high altitude, trained to hit stationary ships from 10,000 feet. According to the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum, Japanese pilots flew hundreds of practice missions, refining their tactics and timing. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was chosen to command the strike force, officially designated the First Air Fleet, or Kido Butai, the mobile force. Nagumo was a cautious, by-the-book officer, a surface warfare specialist uncomfortable with the risks of carrier operations. But he was senior and available. Under his command were 6 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the most powerful concentration of carrier air power ever assembled. Supporting them were 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. 8 oilers would accompany the force to refuel the ships at sea. On November 26, 1941, the strike force departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. The carriers set course east, then southeast, following a route far north of normal shipping lanes. Radio operators on each ship maintained absolute silence. False radio traffic was transmitted from Japanese home waters to make American intelligence believe the carriers were still in port. The weather was terrible. Storms battered the fleet. Waves 30 feet high crashed over the destroyer's bows. Refueling operations were nightmarish. Oilers and warships struggling to maintain position in heaving seas while pumping thousands of gallons of fuel through hoses stretched between them. The fleet pushed forward, and each day brought them closer to Hawaii. American patrol aircraft from Oahu flew their routine search patterns, looking north, south, and west. They did not search northwest, the direction from which Nagumo's carriers approached. On December 2nd, the strike force received a coded message from Tokyo: "Climb Mount Niitaka." The attack was confirmed. There would be no turning back. By December 6th, the carriers were 230 miles north of Oahu. Crews prepared their aircraft. Torpedoes were loaded, specially modified with wooden fins to operate in Pearl Harbor's shallow 40-foot depths. Armor-piercing bombs converted from 16-inch battleship shells were hoisted into bomb bays. Belts of ammunition were fed into machine guns. Pilots gathered for final briefings. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the air attack, thus addressed his aviators. The target was the American Pacific Fleet, Battleship Row. The airfields at Wheeler, Hickam, and Ewa. The objective was simple: destroy as much as possible in the first wave, sink the battleships, burn the aircraft on the ground, cripple America's ability to project power in the Pacific. At 6 o'clock on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the carriers turned into the wind. The first wave of 183 aircraft, 43 fighters, 49 high-level bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 40 torpedo bombers, roared down the flight decks and climbed into the pre-dawn darkness. Behind them, deck crews prepared the second wave of 167 aircraft. Commander Fuchida led the formation south toward Oahu. The rising sun broke over the horizon. Below, the ocean was calm, and ahead 70 miles away lay Pearl Harbor and the sleeping American Pacific Fleet. Chapter 3. Dawn of Infamy. The attack coordinators aboard the carriers had set H-hour, the moment of attack, for 800 hours, Hawaiian time. But Commander Fuchida's formation reached Oahu's north shore ahead of schedule. At 7:40 in the morning, the island came into view. The peak of Diamond Head rose above the clouds. Fuchida could see Honolulu's buildings catching the morning light. And there, beyond the city, lay Pearl Harbor. Through his binoculars, Fuchida counted the ships, battleships moored in pairs along the southeast shore of Ford Island, cruisers and destroyers at their berths, auxiliaries and support vessels crowding the harbor. The American Pacific Fleet lay at anchor, peaceful and unprepared. Fuchida fired a single flare, the signal for surprise attack, and his radio operator tapped out the message that would echo through history. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, tiger, tiger. The code confirmed total surprise. Then Fuchida gave the order to attack. At 7:48 in the morning, the first bombs fell. According to eyewitness accounts preserved by the Library of Congress, sailors and soldiers across Oahu heard the sound before they understood what it meant. A roar of engines, the whistle of falling bombs, then explosions. The seaplane base at Ford Island erupted in flames. Hangars collapsed. PBY Catalina patrol aircraft, lined up wingtip to wingtip for easy maintenance, were obliterated in seconds. At Hickam Field, Japanese bombs walked across the flight line. B-17 and B-18 bombers, parked close together to prevent sabotage, the commander's greatest fear, became blazing wreckage. While at Wheeler Field in central Oahu, the Army Air Corps fighter squadron woke to the sound of strafing. Japanese Zero fighters swept low over the barracks and hangars, their machine guns ripping through buildings and aircraft. P-40 Warhawks and P-36 fighters sat exposed on the runway. Pilots sprinted from their quarters, some still in pajamas, but there was nothing they could do. Their aircraft were already burning. On Battleship Row, the morning had begun quietly. Sailors were eating breakfast, reading the Sunday paper, writing letters home. Church services were scheduled for 900 hours. Many men were still asleep. The crew of the USS Arizona had just raised the colors when the first wave hit. Torpedo bombers came in low over the water, barely 50 feet above the surface. What their targets were the battleships moored along Ford Island's eastern shore. Nevada, Arizona, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, Oklahoma, and California. The torpedoes were masterpieces of Japanese naval engineering. Modified with wooden fins to operate in shallow water, they dropped from the aircraft, splashed into the harbor, and ran straight and true toward their targets. The USS Oklahoma took 3 torpedoes on her port side within the first 10 minutes. The explosions tore massive holes in her hull. Water poured into her compartments. She began rolling to port. As documented by the Naval History and Heritage Command, men trapped below decks tried desperately to escape through hatches and passageways that were turning sideways, then upside down, as the ship capsized. Some made it out. Most did not. At 8:08 in the morning, at 12 minutes after the first bomb fell, the Oklahoma rolled completely over. Her hull broke the surface, trapping 429 men inside. The USS West Virginia took 6 or 7 torpedoes. Survivors' accounts vary. Her captain, Mervyn Bennion, was mortally wounded by shrapnel from an explosion on the nearby Tennessee. He remained on the bridge, giving orders as his ship settled into the harbor mud. Counterflooding by damage control parties kept the West Virginia from capsizing like the Oklahoma, but she sank at her moorings, flames consuming her superstructure. Then came the Arizona. At 8:06 in the morning, a 1,600-pound armor-piercing bomb, a converted naval shell, dropped from a high-level bomber 10,000 feet above the harbor. When the bomb struck the Arizona near her No. 2 turret and penetrated deep into the ship before detonating. The explosion touched off the forward ammunition magazines. According to the National Park Service, which now maintains the USS Arizona Memorial, the resulting detonation was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in naval history. The force lifted the Arizona's bow out of the water. Fire and smoke erupted in a column rising over 500 feet. The forward part of the ship, everything ahead of the mainmast, was obliterated. The blast killed 1,177 men, nearly half of all American deaths that morning, in a matter of seconds. Seaman Russell Lott, who survived because he was ashore that morning, had later described what he saw in testimony preserved by the Library of Congress. The whole forward part of the ship was a mass of flames and twisted metal. You couldn't tell where the deck had been. Men were in the water, covered in oil, screaming. Some were on fire. The ship just seemed to break apart. The second wave arrived at 8:54 in the morning. 167 more aircraft, 78 dive bombers, 54 high-level bombers, and 35 fighters. They found Pearl Harbor transformed into a vision of hell. Thick black smoke from burning fuel oil rolled across the water. Ships were sinking, capsizing, or blazing from stem to stern. But there were still targets. The Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became the focus of intense bombing as she tried to escape the harbor. It hit multiple times, and fearing she would sink in the channel and block the harbor entirely, her captain deliberately grounded her at Hospital Point. The attacks continued until 1000 hours. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the Japanese aircraft departed. They formed up and flew north, back toward their carriers. Behind them, Pearl Harbor was a scene of devastation that photographs alone could not fully capture. Chapter 4. The Human Cost. The numbers tell part of the story. According to official reports compiled by the Department of Defense and preserved in the National Archives, 2,403 Americans were killed on December 7, 1941. 1,178 were wounded. But numbers cannot convey what those losses meant. The individual stories, the final moments, the grief that would follow. On the USS Arizona, Entire families were wiped out. Brothers who had enlisted together, fathers and sons. The ship carried a crew of 1,512 men. Only 335 survived. Most of those who died were killed instantly in the magazine explosion. Their remains were never recovered. They are still there, inside the hull, which sits on the harbor bottom. As the ship is their tomb, protected now as a war grave and national memorial. Aboard the capsized Oklahoma, men trapped inside pounded on the hull, trying to signal rescuers. Navy divers and shipyard workers spent days cutting through the thick steel plating. They saved 32 men, but 429 others perished, either killed by the initial explosions and flooding, or trapped in air pockets that gradually filled with water or became unbreathable. Some of those men survived for hours, writing final messages to their families on the bulkheads, visible when the Oklahoma was later raised and scrapped. The West Virginia sank upright, her hull resting on the bottom. When salvage crews entered the ship months later, they found the bodies of 3 sailors in a storeroom deep in the ship. They had survived the attack, but found an air pocket, and marked off 16 days on a calendar before their air ran out. They died slowly, in darkness, knowing rescue would not come in time. At Hickam Field, ground crews and administrative personnel were killed by bombs and strafing. The base chapel took a direct hit during morning services. The base mess hall, filled with men eating breakfast, was destroyed. Witnesses described bodies torn apart, men bleeding out in the wreckage, medical personnel overwhelmed by casualties arriving faster than they could treat them. Civilians died too. Japanese aircraft strafed Honolulu neighborhoods. Bombs intended for military targets fell in residential areas. Anti-aircraft shells fired by American defenders, fitted with timed fuses, arced up and then fell back to earth unexploded or detonated over the city, as a mother and her children were killed in their home. A restaurant worker died when a shell crashed through the roof. 68 civilians were killed, another 35 wounded. The medical response was heroic but chaotic. According to research from the Uniformed Services University, military hospitals were not prepared for mass casualties on this scale. Tripler Army Hospital and the Navy Hospital at Pearl Harbor were quickly overwhelmed. Operating rooms ran continuously. Doctors performed surgery on mess tables, on the floor, wherever they could find space. Blood supplies ran out. Volunteers lined up to donate. Morphine stocks were exhausted within hours. Some men died not from their wounds, but from shock and blood loss while waiting for treatment. Burn victims suffered terribly. When ships exploded or caught fire, a fuel oil on the water ignited. Men abandoning ship jumped into water that was literally on fire. Those who survived carried terrible injuries. According to the American Burn Association's historical records, medical knowledge of severe burn treatment in 1941 was limited. Many burn victims who survived the attack itself died days or weeks later from infection or complications. The psychological trauma was equally devastating, though less documented at the time. Men who survived watched their friends die. They saw shipmates burning, drowning, or blown apart. Some survived only through luck, a change in watch schedule, a decision to go ashore the night before, a transfer that arrived days earlier. The guilt of survival, now recognized as a component of post-traumatic stress, haunted many veterans for the rest of their lives. Whilst on the Japanese side, losses were remarkably light. 29 aircraft were shot down. 4 midget submarines were sunk. 65 Japanese servicemen were killed. One, Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, became the first Japanese prisoner of war when his midget submarine ran aground and he was captured. But Japan had miscalculated catastrophically. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego. The carriers had been Yamamoto's primary targets. Without them, the strategic value of the attack was compromised. More critically, Japanese aircraft did not target Pearl Harbor's massive fuel storage tanks, which held 4.5 million barrels of oil, or the repair facilities and dry docks. Nagumo, cautious and concerned about American carriers possibly nearby, declined to launch a third wave. This decision allowed the Americans to salvage and repair much of the damaged fleet. Of the 8 battleships hit, 6 would return to service. The Oklahoma and Arizona were total losses, but the others would fight again. Chapter 5. A Nation Transformed. At 2:20 in the afternoon, Eastern Time, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received confirmation of the attack. He was in his study at the White House, meeting with Harry Hopkins, his closest advisor. The telephone call came from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. Roosevelt's first reaction, according to Hopkins's notes preserved at the Roosevelt Presidential Library, was disbelief. Then came cold fury. The president immediately convened his cabinet. Military leaders were summoned. According to documents from the National Archives, Roosevelt spent the evening receiving reports, dictating responses, and preparing to address Congress. He worked late into the night on the speech he would deliver the next day. Draft after draft crossed his desk. Roosevelt personally edited the opening line, a date which will live in world history to a date which will live in infamy. That single word, infamy, captured the sense of betrayal, the rage, the determination that would define America's response. At 12:30 in the afternoon on December 8, 1941, Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. The House chamber was packed. Senators, representatives, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, military leaders, and diplomats filled every seat. Millions more listened on radio broadcasts across the nation. Roosevelt's voice was firm, clear, and controlled as he began. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The speech lasted 6 minutes. When Roosevelt detailed the attacks on Pearl Harbor and simultaneous Japanese assaults on Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway. He declared that the United States was already at war, that the attack had made war inevitable. Then he asked Congress for a formal declaration of war against Japan. According to the Library of Congress, the vote was nearly unanimous. Only one member of Congress, Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, voted against the declaration. By 4:10 that afternoon, the United States was officially at war with Japan. 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, honoring their tripartite pact obligations to Japan. America was now engaged in a two-front global war against the Axis powers, and the isolationism that had dominated American politics throughout the 1930s evaporated overnight. Public opinion transformed with stunning speed. According to polling data analyzed by the Pew Research Center, support for entering the war rose from 40% before the attack to 97% immediately after. The military response was swift. Enlistment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers. According to Department of Defense records, more than 1 million men enlisted in the month following Pearl Harbor. The draft was expanded. Industrial mobilization accelerated. Factories that had been producing automobiles and appliances retooled for war production. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it, began operating at full capacity. The social consequences were profound and, in some cases, shameful, when anti-Japanese sentiment exploded across the nation. Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, faced suspicion, discrimination, and violence. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced removal and incarceration of 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. Families were given days to sell their homes and businesses, often at devastating losses. They were transported to internment camps in remote areas, tar paper barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. According to the Smithsonian Institution and the research compiled for the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, this action was driven by racism and wartime hysteria, not military necessity. As no Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage. Decades later, in 1988, the United States government formally apologized and provided reparations to survivors. Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry. Remember Pearl Harbor appeared on recruiting posters, war bonds, and propaganda materials. The attack unified the nation in a way few events in American history have. Political divisions faded. Labor disputes paused. The entire society mobilized for total war. The strategic impact of Pearl Harbor was not what Yamamoto had hoped. Rather than forcing America to the negotiating table, the attack ensured that the United States would fight until Japan's unconditional surrender. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction proved accurate. Japan won victories for 6 months. Then came Midway in June 1942, where American carriers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. From that point forward, American industrial and military might ground Japan down in a war of attrition it could not win. The human cost continued long after December 7th. Many of the wounded died later from their injuries. Others carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Families mourned fathers, sons, and brothers who never came home. The attack killed more Americans than the Battle of Antietam during the Civil War, more than the Spanish-American War, more Americans than died in the entire Revolutionary War. Today, the USS Arizona Memorial stands above the sunken battleship in Pearl Harbor. According to the National Park Service, oil still leaks from the wreck, 9 quarts per day, are rising to the surface in small droplets that visitors call the tears of the Arizona. The memorial receives more than 1.8 million visitors each year. It remains an active military cemetery, the final resting place for the crew of the Arizona. The attack on Pearl Harbor lasted less than 2 hours. Its consequences shaped the remainder of the 20th century. It drew America fully into World War II, transforming the nation from an isolationist democracy into a global superpower. It demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful military forces to surprise attack. And it proved that distance and oceans could no longer protect America from war. December 7th, 1941, remains a date that lives in infamy. Not because of the military defeat. Battles are won and lost throughout history, but because it marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. America before Pearl Harbor was a nation divided, uncertain about its role in the world. America after Pearl Harbor was a nation united, committed to victory at any cost. That transformation, born in fire and blood on a Sunday morning in Hawaii, defined the generation that fought World War II and built the world that followed.